This is HOA Karma Files. The HOA made it personal, and I made it documented. I heard her before I saw her. Patricia Carter was already halfway up my driveway, waving a boot clamp key in one hand and a snow-soaked notebook in the other, yelling about my reflective snow stakes being a code violation. I had a delivery of medical supplies arriving in 2 hours for my sister, and Patricia was threatening to mark it as clutter immediately if I did not remove every single stake before she finished her patrol. The stakes were standard reflectors, the kind you buy at any hardware store to mark your driveway edges so the plow does not rip up your landscaping. But Patricia did not care about logic. She cared about control. I moved to Bend, Oregon 6 months ago because my sister needed full-time care after her accident, and the cost of living here was slightly more manageable than Portland. I worked as a security systems installer, which meant I understood cameras, privacy laws, and how to document every interaction. The Quarry Ridge Frostline HOA board was notorious for enforcing rules that did not exist, and Patricia Carter, the neighborhood watch liaison, treated residents like suspects. She carried a ruler and a stopwatch, measuring snow pile heights and timing how long it took you to shovel after a storm. The HOA name was plastered on every corner sign, every mailbox cluster, every snow emergency notice. It was a community where compliance was currency, and Patricia was the enforcer. Patricia stopped 3 feet from me, her breath fogging in the freezing air. She said, "I do not care what the weather did. I care what the rule says. Your stakes are a violation. You have until noon to remove them, or I am issuing a fine." I asked her which rule, specifically prohibited reflective markers. She flipped open her notebook, ran a finger down a page that looked like it had been rewritten a dozen times, and said, Section 12, Subsection 4, Temporary Structures. I told her those stakes were not structures, they were safety markers. She smiled, the kind of smile that said she had heard every excuse before and it did not matter. She said, "I can fine you daily until the snow melts and you cry." Then she turned and walked back down the driveway, writing something in her notebook as she went. I pulled out my phone and texted my contact, a local journalist named Elise who had covered HOA abuse cases in the area before. I sent her a quick summary: Patricia Carter, Quarry Ridge Frostline, targeting me over reflective stakes, threatening daily fines, delivery deadline in 2 hours. Elise responded within minutes. She said, "Document everything. Get her on video if you can. These boards hate sunlight." I had 3 doorbell cameras and a dash cam system I installed myself when I moved in. Every angle of my property was covered. I did not correct Patricia's lie about the rule, because I wanted her to commit to it in public. An hour later, I got a notification on my phone. The gate access system at the community entrance had flagged my code as suspended. I tried the app 3 times, same result. I called the management company, and they said there was a note on my account about unpaid fines. I told them I had not received any fines, paid or unpaid. The woman on the phone sounded tired. She said, "You will need to take that up with the board. Your access is locked until the account is cleared." I asked her how I was supposed to get my sister's medical delivery if the gate would not open. She paused, then said, "You can meet the driver at the gate and escort them in manually. That would mean standing outside in 12-degree weather, waiting for a delivery window I did not control, while Patricia patrolled the neighborhood looking for her next target." I called Elise again. She told me to file a records request immediately, asking for the covenant section Patricia cited, plus any board meeting minutes where temporary structures were defined. She said, if they are inventing rules, the paper trail will show it. I drafted the email and sent it to the management company with a CC to the board. I kept it calm and professional, just asking for clarification on the rule and the fine process. Then I went outside and checked the stakes. They were exactly where I had planted them, reflective tape catching the weak winter sunlight. A couple on the porch across the street watched the whole thing like it was a show. The guy gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "We see what is happening, and it is ridiculous." The delivery driver called me 20 minutes later. He said he was at the gate and it would not open. I grabbed my keys and jogged down the hill to the entrance. The keypad was frozen solid, ice crusted over the buttons. I tried my code manually, and nothing happened. The driver, a guy in his 50s with a company jacket and a tired expression, said, I cannot wait here all day. I have 12 more stops. I told him to follow me in when another car triggered the gate. He shook his head and said, if the system logs me as unauthorized, my company gets fined. I cannot risk it. I pulled out my phone and showed him the email I had sent to management, the one asking for clarification on my account status. He glanced at it, then said, look, I believe you, but I need paperwork that says I am allowed in. I do not have that. I called the management company again. This time, I got a different person, a man who sounded annoyed before I even finished explaining. He said, your account shows a violation notice issued this morning. You need to pay the fine before access is restored. I asked him how much the fine was. He said, $300 plus a $50 administrative fee, plus a winter enforcement surcharge of $75. I told him I never received a notice, and the rule Patricia cited did not exist in the covenants. He said, that is between you and the board. Pay the fine or stay locked out. I stood at the gate in 12-degree cold, watching the delivery driver pull away with the supplies my sister needed. My hands were numb even inside my gloves. I could see Patricia 2 blocks away, walking her patrol route with her notebook, stopping at every driveway to measure snow piles with her ruler. She looked up, saw me standing there, and smiled. I went back to my house and started pulling documents. I had copies of the original covenants, the amendments, and every notice I had received since moving in. Section 12, subsection 4, said nothing about temporary structures. It covered permanent fences and sheds. The word temporary did not appear anywhere in the section. I scanned every page and saved them as PDFs. Then I checked my mailbox. There was a single envelope, plain white, no return address. Inside was a typed notice on Quarry Ridge Frostline letterhead. It said I was being fined $425 for unauthorized driveway markers, and that failure to pay within 72 hours would result in a lien on my property. The notice was dated 2 days ago, but the postmark showed it was mailed yesterday. The math did not add up. I called Elise and walked her through everything. She said, they backdated the notice so they could claim you were already in violation when they locked the gate. That is fraud. You need to document the postmark and file a complaint with the state. I asked her what kind of complaint. She said, start with the Attorney General's office, Real Estate Division. HOAs are regulated, and if they are inventing fees and backdating notices, that is a paper trail the state will care about. I took photos of the envelope, the notice, and the postmark. Then I sent the whole packet to Elise and copied myself. That night, I got an email from the management company. It said my account was under review for multiple violations, and that a hearing had been scheduled for the following week. The email listed 3 charges: unauthorized temporary structures, failure to remove snow from common areas, and obstruction of emergency access. The first charge was the stakes. The second charge was nonsense, because I had shoveled my driveway and walkway within 6 hours of the last storm. The third charge was new, and I had no idea what it referred to. The email said failure to attend the hearing would result in automatic penalties, including a lien and possible towing of any vehicles parked in violation. I spent the next 2 days gathering evidence. I pulled the timestamps from my doorbell cameras, showing exactly when I had shoveled and when Patricia had walked past without saying a word. I printed screen captures from the Weather Service, showing the storm timeline and the 6-hour compliance window the HOA claimed to enforce. I requested certified mail receipts for every notice the board claimed to have sent me. Only one came back, the backdated fine notice. The rest did not exist. I also filed the state complaint Elise recommended, attaching the photos of the postmark and the covenant sections Patricia had misquoted. Then I waited. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening at the clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early with a folder full of documents and my phone charged to 100%. The board sat at a long table in the front of the room. 3 members, plus Patricia, who was listed as an advisor. The president, a man in his 60s with a tie and a grim expression, opened the meeting by reading the charges against me. He said I had willfully violated multiple sections of the covenants and ignored repeated warnings. I asked him to specify which warnings. He shuffled some papers, then said, "The board sent multiple notices. You failed to respond." I held up the single envelope I had received and said, This is the only notice I got, and it was backdated. The postmark proves it. Patricia leaned forward and said, "You are wasting everyone's time with excuses. The rule is clear. Remove the stakes or pay the fine." I asked her to show me the rule. She flipped open her notebook and read the same Section 12, subsection 4, line she had given me before. I pulled out my printed copy of the covenants and said, "That section does not mention temporary structures. It covers permanent installations." Patricia stared at me, then said, "The board interprets the rules as needed." I said, "The board does not have the authority to rewrite the covenants." The president banged his hand on the table and said, "This is not a courtroom. We are here to resolve violations, not debate semantics." I asked if I could present evidence. The president sighed and said, "You have 2 minutes." I handed out copies of the covenant section Patricia had cited, the weather service timeline, and the doorbell camera timestamps. Then I showed them the postmark on the notice. I said, "This notice was mailed the day after the date it claims to have been sent. That means the fine was issued before I was notified. The board cannot penalize me for something I was not told about." One of the other board members, a woman in her 50s, looked uncomfortable. She glanced at Patricia, then at the documents. Patricia said, "He is trying to confuse the issue. The rule stands." I pulled out my phone and opened the video I had saved from the morning Patricia confronted me. I said, "I have footage of the interaction where she threatened daily fines. I also have her saying the stakes were a violation, but she never cited a specific rule. I am happy to play it for the board." The president held up a hand and said, "That will not be necessary. We have reviewed the evidence and determined that the fine is appropriate. You have 72 hours to pay or face further penalties." I asked what those penalties were. He said, "A lien on your property and immediate towing of any non-compliant vehicles." I told him I did not have any non-compliant vehicles. Patricia said, "Your truck has been parked in the same spot for 3 days. That is a violation of the rotation rule." I had never heard of a rotation rule. I asked Patricia to explain it. She said, "Vehicles must be moved every 48 hours to prevent long-term storage." I told her my truck was not stored, it was parked in my assigned space. She smiled and said, "The board defines storage as any vehicle that remains stationary for more than 2 days." I looked at the president and said, "Is that in the covenants?" He did not answer. Patricia said, "The board has the authority to enforce community standards. If you do not like it, you can appeal." I asked how to file an appeal. The president said, "Submit a written request to the management company. They will schedule a follow-up hearing in 30 days. 30 days was too long. My sister needed her medication refills, I had work commitments, and I could not afford to have my truck towed or my property liened over fake rules. I told the board I would be filing a formal complaint with the state and requesting an independent audit of the covenant enforcement process. Patricia laughed and said, "Good luck with that. The state does not care about your snow stakes." The president ended the meeting and told me the fine was due by Sunday. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next nightmare story. I left the meeting and sat in my truck for 10 minutes, letting the heater warm up while I ran through my options. I could pay the fine and move on, but that would set a precedent where Patricia could invent new rules whenever she wanted. I could fight it through the appeal process, but that would take a month and leave me vulnerable to more harassment. Or I could go nuclear and force the board to defend every claim in public. I chose the third option. I called Elise and told her what happened. She said, "You need to get that video in front of someone who can act on it. File a records complaint with the management company and demand meeting minutes for the last 6 months. If the board voted on these enforcement rules, it should be in the minutes. If it is not, then they are making it up as they go." I drafted the complaint that night and sent it certified mail to the management company, the board president, and Patricia. I also requested copies of all fines issued in the last year, broken down by violation type and resident. If Patricia was targeting me specifically, the pattern would show. 2 days later, I got a response from the management company. They said the records request was under review and would take up to 30 days to process. In the meantime, my gate access would remain suspended until the fine was paid. I told them I was not paying a fraudulent fine and that I had already filed a state complaint. The woman on the phone said, "That is your choice, but the suspension stands." I asked if emergency vehicles could access my property if my sister needed help. She paused, then said, "Emergency services have override codes. Your personal access is separate." That same afternoon, I saw a tow truck pull up to my driveway. The driver got out and started taking photos of my truck. I walked outside and asked what he was doing. He said, "I got a call about a vehicle in violation. I need to document it before I hook it up." I asked who called. He showed me a work order on his tablet. It listed the Quarry Ridge Frostline HOA as the requester and Patricia Carter as the contact. The violation was listed as long-term storage. I told the driver my truck was not in violation and that the rule Patricia cited did not exist in the covenants. He shrugged and said, "I just do what the order says. If you have a problem, take it up with the HOA." I pulled out my phone and showed the driver the covenant section on vehicle parking. I said, "There is no rotation rule. The board is inventing violations to harass me." The driver looked at the screen, then at his tablet, then back at me. He said, "Look, I do not want to get in the middle of a HOA fight. If you can prove this is bogus, I will refuse the job. But I need something official." I pulled up the email I had sent to the management company, the one with the covenant section in the records complaint. The driver read it, then nodded. He said, "That is good enough for me. I am not towing a truck based on a rule that does not exist." He closed his tablet, got back in the tow truck, and drove away. I watched the tow truck disappear down the street, then turned and saw Patricia standing on the sidewalk 2 houses away. She was holding her phone, pointed at me, recording. I waved at her. She lowered the phone and walked toward me, her expression furious. She said, "You just cost me a tow fee." I told her I cost her nothing, because the tow was illegal. She said, "The board voted to enforce the rotation rule last month. It is on record." I asked her to show me the minutes from that meeting. She said, "You will get them when the management company releases them." I told her I had already requested them, and that if the vote happened, it would show up. She said, "You are wasting everyone's time with your little investigation. No one cares about your snow stakes or your truck." I said, "You care enough to call a tow truck and try to have my vehicle impounded." She stepped closer and said, "I can fine you daily until the snow melts and you cry." It was the second time she had used that exact phrase, and I made sure my doorbell camera caught it. I said, "You already said that." She said, "Because it is true. You are in violation, and you will pay." Then she turned and walked away, writing something in her notebook. That night, I got a call from Elise. She said, "The state complaint is moving forward. They opened an investigation into the HOA's enforcement practices. You should get a notice in the next week." I asked her what that meant for the fine. She said, "It does not make the fine go away, but it does mean the board has to defend their actions in writing. If they cannot produce the meeting minutes or the covenant amendment, the state will flag it as improper enforcement. That puts pressure on the management company to audit the board." The next morning, I woke up to a new email from the management company. It said the board had scheduled an emergency meeting to address recent compliance issues, and that all residents with pending violations were required to attend. The meeting was set for Saturday morning at the clubhouse. I forwarded the email to Elise and asked if she wanted to come as a witness. She said, "Absolutely. Bring every document you have. This is when they either back down or double down, and either way, you want it on record." Saturday morning was brutal. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees overnight, and the roads were coated in black ice. I drove to the clubhouse slowly, my truck sliding twice on the way. Elise met me in the parking lot. She had a camera bag over one shoulder and a notebook in her hand. She said, "They are going to try to intimidate you. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and do not let them derail the conversation." I told her I had everything printed and organized. She said, "Good. Let them think they are in control, then hit them with the evidence." The clubhouse was packed. At least 20 residents were there, most of them looking annoyed or confused. The board sat at the same long table, and Patricia stood beside them with her notebook. The president opened the meeting by saying there had been a pattern of non-compliance in the community and that the board was taking steps to restore order. He said the emergency meeting was necessary to address multiple violations that had been ignored despite repeated warnings. Then he started reading a list of fines and violations. My name was third on the list. He said I owed $425 for unauthorized driveway markers, plus an additional $250 for failure to comply with a tow order. I stood up and said, I never failed to comply with a tow order. The driver refused the job after I showed him the covenant section that proved the violation was fake. The president said, the board has the authority to interpret the covenants as needed to maintain community standards. I said, the board does not have the authority to rewrite the rules. Patricia said, you are disrupting the meeting. I pulled out my folder and held it up. I said, I have the covenant sections, the postmark notice, the doorbell camera footage, and a state complaint number. If the board wants to continue with these fake fines, I am happy to present everything here. One of the other board members, the woman who had looked uncomfortable at the first hearing, said, can we see the documents? The president said, this is not a trial. We are here to discuss compliance, not debate the rules. I said, you are demanding payment for violations that do not exist. That is fraud. The room went silent. Patricia stepped forward and said, how dare you accuse the board of fraud? I said, I am not accusing anyone. I am stating a fact. You cited Section 12, subsection 4 as the basis for the fine, but that section does not mention temporary structures. You backdated the notice so you could claim I was already in violation when you locked my gate. You called a tow truck based on a rotation rule that does not appear in any covenant amendment. That is not interpretation. That is fabrication. Elise stood up and said, I am a journalist covering HOA compliance issues in the area, and I have copies of everything he just mentioned. If the board wants to continue with these fines, I am happy to run a story on how Quarry Ridge Frostline is inventing rules and targeting residents with fake violations. The president looked at Patricia, then at Elise, then at me. He said, this meeting is over. We will reconvene once the management company has completed their review. Patricia said no. We are not backing down. This resident is in violation, and he will pay. The president said, Patricia, sit down. She said, I am the neighborhood watch liaison. I have the authority to enforce the rules. He said, you have the authority to report violations, not to invent them. Now sit down. Patricia stared at him, her face red, then grabbed her notebook and walked out of the room. The president cleared his throat and said, the board will review the evidence and issue a revised decision within 10 days. In the meantime, all pending fines are suspended, and gate access will be restored. I asked if that included the tow order. He said, there is no tow order. The driver refused the job, so the order is void. I said, and the rotation rule? He hesitated, then said, the board is reviewing all enforcement policies to ensure they align with the covenants. That was as close to an admission as I was going to get. After the meeting, Elise and I stood in the parking lot while she took notes. She said, that was a perfect example of what happens when boards operate without oversight. They think they can say anything and residents will just comply. You called their bluff and they folded. I asked her what came next. She said, the state investigation will take a few months, but the management company will want to clean this up fast. If the board keeps pushing fake fines, the company could lose their contract. Expect them to settle quietly and hope you do not sue. I went home and checked my gate access. It worked. I drove through and parked in my usual spot, then walked up to my front door. My sister was sitting in the living room, her medication schedule taped to the table beside her. She asked how the meeting went. I told her it went exactly how it needed to. She said, did they back down? I said not yet, but they will. The next week, I got a package in the mail. It was a thick envelope from the management company, marked certified mail. Inside were copies of the meeting minutes for the last 6 months. I spread them out on the kitchen table and started reading. There was no mention of a rotation rule. There was no vote on temporary structures. There was one line, buried in the October minutes, that said the board had discussed increasing enforcement of existing rules, but it did not specify which rules or how. The minutes also showed that Patricia had been appointed as Neighborhood Watch Liaison without a board vote. She had simply started calling herself that, and no one had challenged her. I scanned every page and sent the full set to Elise. She called me an hour later and said, "This is gold." The board never voted on the rules she was enforcing. That means every fine she issued is invalid. You need to send this to the management company with a demand for a full refund. I drafted the email that night. I kept it short and factual. I said the minutes proved the rotation rule and the temporary structures interpretation were never adopted by the board, and that all fines issued under those rules were void. I requested a full refund of the $425, plus the $250 for the tow order, plus compensation for the gate lockout. I also requested that Patricia Carter be removed from any enforcement role pending the state investigation. The response came 2 days later. The management company said they were conducting an internal audit of the board's enforcement practices, and that all pending fines would be suspended until the audit was complete. They also said Patricia Carter had been placed on a no-contact directive by management, and that any further violations would need to be reported directly to the management company, not through the Neighborhood Watch Liaison. The email did not mention a refund, but it did say the board would be reviewing all fines issued in the last 6 months to determine which ones were valid. I forwarded the email to Elise. She said, "That is a huge win. The no-contact directive means she cannot harass you anymore, and the audit means every fine she issued is under scrutiny. If the board does not refund you voluntarily, you can file a small claim suit and use the audit as evidence." I told her I would wait to see what the audit turned up before deciding on next steps. A week later, I got a call from the board president. He sounded tired. He said, "I want to apologize for the confusion over the enforcement process. The board has determined that several fines were issued in error, including yours. We will be refunding the full amount within 30 days. He paused, then said, "We are also making changes to the hearing process to ensure residents cannot be railroaded in the future. All fines will require documented covenant citations, and all hearings will include a review period where residents can submit evidence before a decision is made." I asked him what happened to Patricia. He said, "She resigned from the Neighborhood Watch role. The board voted to eliminate the position entirely. From now on, all violations will be reported through the management company, and the board will vote on enforcement actions as a group." I thanked him and hung up. It was not everything I wanted, but it was enough to stop the harassment. The refund check arrived 3 weeks later. $425 plus $250 plus a $100 credit toward future HOA fees as compensation for the gate lockout. I deposited the check and sent a copy of the receipt to Elise. She wrote a follow-up story about the Quarry Ridge Frostline HOA audit and the policy changes the board had implemented. The story ran in the local paper and got picked up by a regional news site. Within a week, I started getting emails from other residents who had been fined under fake rules. They wanted to know how I had fought back. I met with a group of them at the clubhouse the following month. There were 8 residents total, all of them with similar stories. Patricia had targeted them over snowpile placement, shoveling timelines, holiday decorations, and vehicle parking. One woman had been fined for leaving her trash cans out 15 minutes past the pickup window. Another had been threatened with a lien because his mailbox post was 2 inches shorter than the standard height. The fines ranged from $200 to $600, and none of them were based on actual covenant violations. We drafted a joint complaint to the management company, demanding a full audit of every fine issued in the last 2 years. We also requested copies of all board meeting minutes and a list of every policy change voted on since the current board took over. The management company responded within a week. They said the audit had already identified 43 fines issued under invalid rules, and that refunds would be issued to all affected residents. They also said the board would be required to attend a governance training session before resuming enforcement duties. The governance training happened in late February. Elise attended as a press observer, and I sat in the back row with 3 other residents. The trainer was a woman from a HOA management consulting firm. She spent 2 hours walking the board through covenant enforcement procedures, hearing protocols, and legal limits on rule interpretation. She emphasized that boards could not invent rules, backdate notices, or issue fines without documented covenant citations. She also said residents had the right to appeal any decision and request independent mediation if the board refused to provide evidence. The board members looked uncomfortable the entire time. The president took notes. The other two members asked a few questions, mostly about how to handle disputes without escalating them. Patricia was not there. The trainer said she had been removed from the board entirely following the state investigation, and that the HOA was conducting a search for a new compliance coordinator who would report directly to the management company instead of the board. At the end of the session, the trainer opened the floor for questions. One of the residents asked what would happen if the board ignored the new procedures. The trainer said, if a board continues to operate outside the covenants after training, the management company can terminate their contract and put the HOA into receivership. That means a court-appointed manager takes over until new elections can be held. The board does not want that. The president nodded and said, "We understand." I left the training session feeling cautiously optimistic. The system was not perfect, but the changes were real. The board could no longer operate in the shadows, and residents had a clear process for challenging bad decisions. The HOA changes hearing rules so residents cannot be railroaded became the official policy, printed in the updated resident handbook and posted on the community website. A month later, I got a letter from the state. It said the investigation into Quarry Ridge Frostline HOA had been completed, and that the board had been found in violation of state regulations for improper enforcement and failure to maintain accurate meeting records. The state imposed a fine of $5,000 on the HOA and required the board to submit quarterly compliance reports for the next 2 years. The letter also said Patricia Carter had been placed on a no-contact directive by management, which was now a permanent condition of her residency in the community. I showed the letter to my sister. She said, "So it is really over?" I said, "It is over." She smiled and said, "Good. I was tired of watching you fight." I told her I was tired of fighting too, but it was worth it. She asked what I was going to do with the refund money. I said, "Buy better cameras." The final piece of the story came in March. The HOA held an emergency winter meeting to vote on new board members. 3 residents ran for open seats, including the woman who had been fined for the trash can violation. The meeting was packed, and the vote was unanimous. The old board was out, and the new board immediately passed a resolution refunding all fines issued under invalid rules. The total refund amount was over $12,000, split across 23 residents. The resolution also eliminated the winter enforcement surcharge and capped administrative fees at $25 per violation. Elise wrote a final follow-up story about the board turnover and the refunds. She interviewed 6 residents, including me. The story ran with the headline, Quarry Ridge Frostline HOA overhauls enforcement after state investigation. The board president declined to comment, but the new board president, the woman who had been fined for the trash cans, said, "This community deserves better than rule by intimidation. We are committed to transparency and fairness moving forward." I kept the reflective snow stakes in my driveway. No one said a word. When the snow started to melt in April, I pulled them up and stored them in the garage for next winter. My sister asked if I thought Patricia would try anything else. I said, she cannot. The no-contact directive is permanent, and the new board is watching. She nodded and said, "Good. I am glad it is over." But it was not quite over. In early May, I got a call from the tow truck driver who had refused Patricia's order. He said, "I just wanted to let you know I filed a complaint with the company about that job. They reviewed the work order and determined it was a fraudulent request." The company terminated their contract with Quarry Ridge Frostline and refunded the dispatch fee. I told him I appreciated the follow-up. He said, "I see a lot of HOA nonsense in this job, but that was one of the worst. I am glad you stood up to them." The trump card I had been holding came out during the emergency winter meeting. I did not correct Patricia's lie about the rotation rule, because I wanted her to commit to it in public. When the new board reviewed the meeting minutes and the covenant sections, they found that a certified mail trail proved the board had received my compliance proof and still fined me anyway. The board minutes showed Patricia had submitted a report claiming I refused to comply, but my certified mail receipts showed I had sent the proof 2 days before her report was filed. The new board voted to overturn the decision on the record and issue a public apology. Karen's own clip proved the opposite of her claim, because the doorbell camera footage showed her saying there was no compliance deadline, then later claiming I had missed the deadline. The contradiction was so obvious that the new board used it as an example in the governance training. The funny karma beat happened during the final audit. The management company discovered that Patricia had been claiming mileage reimbursement for her neighborhood patrols, billing the HOA for gas and vehicle wear. The total reimbursement over 2 years was $8,000. The problem was that the neighborhood watch liaison position was volunteer, and reimbursements required board approval. Patricia had been submitting the claims directly to the previous management coordinator, who approved them without checking the board minutes. When the new board found out, they demanded a full refund. Patricia refused, claiming the patrols were part of her duties. The board filed a small claim suit, and Patricia lost. She had to repay the $8,000 plus court costs. Karen gets placed on a no-contact directive by management became the official end of her enforcement power. She could not attend board meetings, could not patrol the neighborhood, and could not contact residents about violations. The directive was printed in the updated resident handbook under a new section titled Harassment Prevention. The HOA changes hearing rules so residents cannot be railroaded became the second major policy change, requiring all violations to include documented covenant citations, a 10-day notice period, and a right to submit written evidence before any hearing. The outcome was exactly what I wanted. Karen was removed from the board in an emergency winter meeting, and the bogus snow fines were automatically refunded to everyone hit in the enforcement wave. The new board passed a resolution banning the neighborhood watch liaison position permanently, and the management company implemented a digital violation tracking system that required photographic evidence and covenant citations for every fine. The system went live in June, and the number of violations dropped by 70% in the first month. I kept the refund check framed on my office wall, not because I needed the money, but because it was proof that standing up to fake rules works. My sister said it was petty. I told her it was a reminder. She asked, what kind of reminder? I said, a reminder that documentation beats intimidation every time. The reflective snow stakes stayed in my garage for the summer, but when the first snow hit in November, I put them back up. No one said a word. The new board president walked past one morning and waved. I waved back. That was it. No notebook, no ruler, no threats. Just a normal neighborhood interaction. Elise ran a final story in December, a year after the whole mess started. She profiled 5 HOAs in the area that had implemented similar reforms after the Quarry Ridge case. The headline was, How One Resident's Fight Changed HOA Enforcement Across Bend. The story included quotes from the new board president, the governance trainer, and me. Elise ended the piece with a line I had told her during the interview. The rules only work if everyone follows them, and that includes the people enforcing them. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.